Hi everyone, this is Dr. Stringer again, and we are talking about sentencing drug offenders this class. So we will go ahead and dive into that. Hopefully you've already read the chapter on that, which I believe is chapter 8 in your textbook. If not, you'll want to do that afterwards. Anyway, um, so there's a common kind of misconception, I think, amongst society that most of the people that are being sentenced to prison are kind of these drug kingpins and these big dangerous drug dealers and stuff that we have to lock away for the goodness of our children and stuff. This is a quote from Judge Mark Bennett, and he talks about how he's sentenced 1,000 nonviolent drug offenders with mandatory sentences from 60 months to life. Um, I think, yeah, so, 1,000 people, 60 months to life for a nonviolent drug offender. He also says he can count on one hand the number of actual drug kingpins that he sentenced. And so his conclusion is that he has been forced to apply these mandatory minimum sentences, mostly to drug offenders with crippling methamphetamine addictions, um, you know, which is not really the intent of these statutes, right? But because of the way that the law is written, he's kind of being forced to do this, and the way that the way that the people have been charged. Um, in 2004, the Sentencing Commission did a survey of federal district court judges, and the results were pretty interesting. They found that 25% reported that their sentences in drug trafficking cases almost always reflected the seriousness of the offense. Um, but about 42% reported that they thought that they were required to impose sentences that were longer than appropriate. So they thought that the guidelines were making them give people longer sentences than were actually justified for the crime. So there's been some trends in sentencing of drug offenders over time, similar to how we talked about it with policing over time and arrests, prosecution. There's been some changes too, as we noted. So looking at this, the war on drugs has of course increased the number of drug offenders convicted and sentenced in the state and federal courts. When you look at the states, sentences have been imposed on offenders convicted of felony drug offenses in the state courts, moving along. And about two-thirds of offenders convicted of drug trafficking and drug possession received jail or prison terms. For possession, you think about it, possession of marijuana is really the only uh, offense that you can get a possession of that's not a felony, which is interesting. Should someone be convicted of a felony for possession of some prescription pills or cocaine or something like that? I mean, I don't think so. To send someone to 5 years for having a gram of cocaine seems kind of silly to me, and making them a convicted felon, which then causes all of these problems with them finding a job and housing and stuff after they even get out. But I'll try not to go on a tangent there. We have that to talk about in future lectures. But these changes remain relatively stable between 94 and '06. And looking at the federal level, uh, the average sentence rose significantly from 82 to 88. It went from 54 months to 71 months. That's the 1980s, right? That's the height of the drug war, so to speak, right? We're really worried about crack. Um, so the average sentence is pretty consistent, moving from 95 to 11, and it ranges from about 72 to 84 months. Looking at that, and so then at '06, you look at the average state drug trafficking sentence was 57 months, but at the federal level, it was about 88 months for a drug trafficking offense. So the feds tend to give a little bit harsher sentences than the states do for these drug offenses. And part of this might be, too, to think about it, the feds don't generally prosecute small crimes. If you're being prosecuted in federal court, you've done something pretty big to attract their attention because they've got a lot to do, and so maybe you were trafficking a lot more, a larger quantity of drugs. That will get you federal attention, um, or crossing the border or state lines and stuff like that can too. Um, higher rates of imprisonment and longer sentences in the federal courts versus state courts. So, if anybody gets prosecuted for a drug offense, hope that you stay in state court, not federal court. I suppose that's part of the moral of that story, right? Or if anyone you know does, I should say, not you all, because you're all very good students. So, some researchers studying sentencing decisions and the factors predicting them, they tend to look at kind of one of two approaches. Hypothetical cases. Um, what they'll do is they'll send hypothetical cases to judges and then tell them to impose sentencing with an option to explain their reasons. The advantage is that judges are provided with the exact same cases. And so it's easier to kind of compare one judge to another because they have the exact same case. Um, and then the other option is to collect data on actual cases. And this happens quite common as well. Obviously, the issue there is you're comparing the case that's in one judge's court to a different case in another judge's court, and so they're not, going to be the exact same case, right? And so there can be differences, and there often are. Cases might be similar, and you can control for various things in your statistical models, but you can't always, control every single little thing. Especially with that kind of data, because you might not have information on everything in that official data set. Anyway, so looking at disparities and discrimination in sentencing, I've actually written a couple of papers on this myself. And so, the disparity would be, is there a difference in treatment or outcome that does not necessarily result from intentional biases or prejudice? And then the opposite of that is there's discrimination, whereas it is kind of this intentional bias or prejudice. So it's a difference in treatment of individuals based on criteria irrelevant to a case. So this would be called what's known as extra legal factors, such as race, gender, and social class. This should not matter at all for sentencing, right? They should not consider whether you're white, black, orange, yellow, green, blue, whatever, with regard to sentencing. The legal factors that they do take into account, the big ones are the seriousness of the offense and the person's prior criminal record. Right? These are legal things to think about. The number of counts, the amount of drugs that they had, whether they're trafficking it or possessing the drug. Just simple possession is a whole lot different, right? So those are what is known as a legal factor. And then these would be considered extra legal factors, so to speak. And so when you look at disparities, there's kind of these different ways that you can have disparities, right? You can have an interjurisdictional disparity, which means that there's sentencing patterns of judges and different jurisdictions vary. And then you can have sentences imposed by judges in the same jurisdiction vary, which is intra-jurisdictional disparities. And then you can have intra-judge disparity, which is when you have inconsistent decisions from the same judge. And so, the sentence might depend on the judge's mood, whether he's in a happy mood or not. Is it Monday morning or is it Friday afternoon? And he's ready to go home, so he's like, okay, whatever. So that can vary, right? So direct versus subtle discrimination. So there's direct, subtle, and then there's an interaction. So one is indirect, then you have the main effect. So, for example, a black or Hispanic offender might face higher odds of incarceration and longer sentences than white offenders convicted of identical crimes, right? This is direct discrimination. And then you have, subtle discrimination or an indirect effect. And this means that blacks are more likely to be in custody prior to trial. And then as a result of being in custody, they get harsher sentences. I actually found this in a juvenile paper that I was looking at recently, and we found that being black didn't make you have more likely to be committed to the Department of Juvenile Justice. However, being black did make it more likely for you to be put in pretrial custody, and then if you're in pretrial custody, that did predict that you're more likely to be sentenced to the Department of Juvenile Justice. So this is kind of an indirect type of thing, looking at that. And then your subtle discriminations might be something like blacks receive harsher sentences than whites for drug offenses, uh, but not for violent crimes or property crimes. Having dependent children reduces the sentence for women, but not for men. So that's kind of where it goes across different factors, right? And we do tend to see this, that, often women who have children will often not get as harsh of a sentence as a man who doesn't have children or something like that. Oh, we got music on here. I tapped my earbud there. Anyway, now that we moved on from that, so looking at the continuum here. So you have pure justice on one end, and then you have systematic discrimination on the other. So the use of the death penalty for rape was systematic discrimination because 85% of those sentenced to death or 89%, I think, were sentenced to death were black. And so that's pretty systematic discrimination, right? We ideally try to strive towards this pure justice, where there's no discrimination in any part. Obviously, this doesn't always happen, right? And so you've got various different types that you can have: contextual, institutional, individual. Maybe one judge is discriminating against people. Looking at that, and so these are all things to think about. Warranted versus unwarranted disparities in sentencing. Remember, there was a difference between a disparity versus discrimination. Discrimination is never warranted. But disparities might be in some situations, right? And so, as it says here, not all disparity is unwarranted. Sometimes you might have some differences in sentencing across different people, right? Maybe one person had a gun and the other person didn't, or maybe one person, had 5 kilos of cocaine and the other person only had a gram. So obviously there would be a little bit of disparity there. So when there's intra-jurisdictional sentencing is a bit more questionable. The sentencing scheme must be applied as evenly as possible, especially within the same jurisdiction. The outcome of the case should not depend on the judge's personal attitudes, beliefs, and stuff like that, or his mood, frankly, but it probably does sometimes, which is unfortunate. Gender disparities in sentencing. Studies show that female drug offenders receive more lenient sentences than males. And there's 2 main reasons for this. And mainly it's because you look at the seriousness of the crime and the prior history, and women often don't have as much of a prior history as men do. And there's also the idea of the perception of dangerousness or blameworthiness and child care responsibilities that play a role here. So those can have things to do with it as well. Men tend to be perceived, oftentimes, although not always, as being more dangerous than women. But then again, there are exceptions to that, obviously. So looking at these things, Stacy and Spohn indicated that females are evaluated differently than males in federal court, regardless of family and child care responsibilities. And so the studies show that gender discrimination still occurs today, and that females are treated more leniently than male offenders. And so this discriminatory treatment of drug offenders based on race and ethnicity is mostly confined to males. And so a lot of times, and we've done this with some prior studies too, is to not just analyze the effect of race on sentencing disparities or discrimination, but to analyze the interaction of race and gender, because you find that there's more discrimination against black males than there are just black people in general, right? So a black woman might not get the same level of discrimination, or she might get more. and so it tends to vary across those things. There tends to be usually pretty good interaction across race and gender. You can oftentimes see it across age as well. If someone is black and they're 65 years old, they might get a lesser sentence than someone who's black and 20 years old. And so that matters as well. Anyway, so racial and ethnic disparities in sentencing drug offenders. The studies tend to indicate that sentences imposed on black and Hispanic defendants are more harsh. Of course, the big problem with this is that the statistics tell us that this is happening, but it doesn't really tell us why. And so that's kind of one of the big questions is why is this happening? So you can have some systematic racial discrimination or disproportionate involvement in serious criminal activity is what some people would say, right? And researchers have tried to employ a variety of different strategies to test these things and explain the disparities in imprisonment rates. Um, and Bloomstein in '93 really concluded that the drug war policies have really contributed to this. And the war on drugs is a main source of racial disproportionality within sentencing. A lot of these drug policies are a direct cause of this. And so that's something to think about as well. Um, and it tends to target resources in black working and middle class areas. Is another thing as well to think about. So looking forward to another study by Spohn and Spears, they found that Hispanics face a greater odds of incarceration than whites in Miami, and that racial minorities and whites had a same incarceration rate in Chicago and Kansas City. So it varies somewhat across place too. Certain cities might have disparities and some might not. And so that's something to think about as well. The study of Steffensmeyer and Demuth, found that sentencing outcomes for Hispanics are more likely to be incarcerated and receive longer sentences than blacks or, oops, what is it? Than blacks or whites. So that's interesting too, right? They say that if you're Hispanic, you're more likely to get incarcerated than black or white people. So maybe they're being treated even more harsh, the harshest of all in these situations, at least in Pennsylvania. Um, the dangerous drug offender. So this is by Steen, Ingen, and Gainey, my buddy Randy. Anyway, so this examined relationships amongst images of threat, right? And they really looked at this matching, whether people match the stereotype of this dangerous drug offender, and these are the people that are being incarcerated. And so they found that the male drug dealers with prior convictions have an increased odds of incarceration 23 times that of white offenders, and 3 times that for black offenders. Um, so if you kind of match this stereotype of being dangerousness seems to really play a role in these things. So it's interesting to think about. But matching the stereotype had no effect on sentence length for black offenders, but an increased sentence length for 13% for white offenders. Remember, this is the odds of incarceration, and then this is looking at sentence length, the length of time you get sentenced to once you're incarcerated. And so the implications of this research are that black defendants are seen as kind of the typical drug offenders, and what white defendants are kind of seen as more of the atypical, which kind of supports this kind of idea of some sort of racial bias going on there. And the last study I'll talk about is Spohn and Sample. And they kind of expanded on the Spohn and Steen study a little bit and found a few different things. They found that black crack dealers are perceived as the most dangerous by judges, and they received the most severe sentences. And this gets to that idea of the blameworthiness or the perceived blameworthiness and dangerousness of crack, right? And kind of this idea of looking at crack as something that needs to be controlled, and kind of this idea that the black crack dealer might be the stereotypical drug dealer that they need to protect society from. I don't agree with that, but I'm just saying that's um, what may be at play there. We try to hypothesize as to why some of these things are happening, and that's kind of what their theory was there. So anyway, it's about 20 minutes on sentencing, so I'll let you all go with that, and I hope you all have a good day, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.